A millionaire paid a homeless woman to bear his child, but when the baby arrived, he fell to his knees, weeping. Charles Woodward, a 45-year-old man who seemed to have everything yet lacked what truly mattered, stood in his luxurious penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side, gazing out at the foggy skyline. The towering skyscrapers surrounding him felt like empty mirrors, reflecting a life filled with financial triumphs, but utterly devoid of deeper meaning. The bustling stock market deals, the city's eternal lights, and the endless murmur of millions below weren't enough to fill the hollow void of loneliness, suffocating him. I have everything a man could want, everything but the one thing that could make me part of something greater than myself. Sure, my name's carved in stone, but there's no one to speak it with a love that will echo across generations. Un enfant de mon âme. A child of my soul, he thought. A seasoned polyglot and globe-trotter, Charles stood in the eerie quiet of his penthouse, high above the city that never sleeps. Despite his towering achievements, he felt trapped by the very success he had worked so hard to achieve. Every deal he closed, every dollar added to his accounts, felt like a dimmed star in the vast darkness of his inner world. Love, with its chaotic and unpredictable nature, was a sea he had no interest in navigating. Too risky, too unstable. What he craved was something simple, a seed he could plant in fertile soil. A child, not a wife bound by fragile promises, but an heir to carry on his legacy when he was gone. Something, someone, his own. He wanted no part of the storms of the heart. After 2 failed marriages, Charles saw love as nothing more than a breeding ground for chaos. There's no room in my life for another emotional disaster, he often reminded himself. His ex-wives had only ever loved his wealth and the image he projected, not the man he truly was. Now, his focus had shifted to something more tangible, an heir. No more empty relationships or fleeting commitments, just someone to continue his lineage without unnecessary complications. Later that same day, while navigating the congested streets of New York in his Lamborghini Diablo, Charles found himself stopped at a red light near Central Park. The familiar chaos of the city swirled around him when, suddenly, a worn figure appeared at his window. It was a young homeless woman with pale skin, disheveled hair, and piercing blue eyes. She extended her hand, her expression a mixture of resignation and hope. With a voice barely audible, she asked, "Do you have anything for me?" Charles looked at her with a cold detachment, his irritation evident in every movement. "Get lost," he snapped, accelerating as soon as the light turned green. "Why waste time on these miseries? My life is too meticulously planned for this nonsense. I've got my own problems." Charles's thoughts churned as he moved through the city streets, an unsettling feeling refusing to leave him. His mind kept circling back to the look in the young woman's eyes. There was something there, something that struck a chord he didn't even know he had. Abruptly, he stopped a few blocks away, took a deep breath, muttered under his breath, and turned the car around, heading back to the intersection where he'd seen her. He found her again, lost in the chaos of the city, like a shadow blending into the noise. Pulling his Lamborghini Diablo to the curb, he rolled down the window. "Get in. No questions," he said, his tone cold, as though issuing a casual command. The young woman locked eyes with him, her blue gaze like a wounded sky scarred by time. She took a small step back, suspicion etched on her face. Life on the streets had taught her to read between the lines and shield herself. Shaking her head, she replied with quiet resolve, her voice carrying a mix of dignity and caution. "I'm not that kind of woman, if that's what you're looking for." Charles raised an eyebrow. Something stirred within him, but his expression remained impassive. Do you honestly think a man like me would be interested in someone like you for that? His voice was sharp, unyielding. You don't even look remotely appealing enough to attract me in that way. You're safe with me. So stop this nonsense and get in. I don't have all day. Or would you rather wander the streets and freeze tonight? She blinked, taken aback by his bluntness. After a moment's hesitation, she complied. There was something disarmingly genuine in his demeanor, even in its harshness. She climbed into the passenger seat, her movements cautious. The car purred as it merged back into the flow of the city. In the silence that followed, Charles glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She looked young, maybe 28, but life had clearly dealt her a cruel hand. Breaking the silence with the same detached tone he used in his business dealings, he spoke. I'm going to make you an offer that will change your life. His voice was calm, calculating, the voice of a man used to negotiating every word. I want a child, not a wife, not a relationship, just a child. I'll pay you a fortune and take care of you throughout the pregnancy. All I need is your womb. After that, you're free to go. Her eyes widened, struggling to process what she'd just heard. A child, she echoed in disbelief, as if the word carried a weight she hadn't encountered before. You promised you wouldn't touch me. Of course not. It'll be through artificial insemination. What did you think? Anything else would be out of the question, Charles replied, his tone matter of fact, as though discussing the most logical solution to a practical problem. She fell silent, the city's noise fading into the background as her mind raced. She thought about how far she'd fallen, a shattered dream, a foreign land, and now this. Her life, once full of promise back in France, was now in ruins. She had no family, no roots, just an overwhelming sense of loneliness. She doubted he could ever understand. As a polyglot and worldly man, he caught her softly murmuring to herself in French, the words heavy with resignation and faint hope. La misère n'a pas de fin. But Charles interrupted her musing. You think I don't understand what you just said? I'm a cosmopolitan businessman. Don't forget that. You said, misery has no end. He paused, his tone still cold, but slightly intrigued. Is this your way out? She let out a long sigh, her shoulders slumping as she nodded, surrendering to the reality of her circumstances. He pressed on, his voice as detached as ever. I have 2 questions. What's your name, and what are you running from? Antoinette Vollier. I'm French, she finally answered, her voice trembling but laced with fragile dignity. I came to the US 5 years ago, crossing the Atlantic for a future I thought was waiting for me. When I arrived here, France seemed to vanish from my heart. I thought that sacrifice would lead to rewards, and that this country would welcome me with open arms. But this city stripped away everything I once was, consuming me bit by bit. I've lost so much. The job, the dreams, even the will to remember why I was fighting. Now, I wander these streets invisible, directionless. Charles, maintaining his composed demeanor, looked at her with the same intensity he'd reserved for a multi-million-dollar deal. Though something within him began to shift. It was just a spark, a faint echo of a forgotten emotion. Antoinette continued, her gaze fixed on some distant corner of her own memory. What am I trying to escape from? She repeated, almost as if asking herself. Everything. This broken life, the empty promises I made to myself, these streets that whisper my failures with every step. I just want to go back home. France. Sometimes I dream of its fields, the scent of chestnut trees, and the sound of rain on the rooftops of my hometown. But here, dreams come at too high a price, and I don't even have enough to buy my way back. A heavy silence hung between them. Antoinette's words had pierced through Charles's armor. This woman, this stranger, stood before him with a raw, unfiltered truth that disarmed him. What lay behind those blue eyes, scarred by life? She was a painful reflection of his own solitude, though hers manifested far more brutally. He took a deep breath, regaining his calculated composure. His expression hardened once more. His voice returned to its usual cold tone. "I understand," he said, pausing for a moment to study her. "Now I'll ask you just once. Will you accept my proposal? Will you carry my child and then leave? I'll set aside a considerable amount for you to return to France and live comfortably there." Antoinette looked at him with a mixture of resignation and relief. For a moment, she thought about all the times she had fallen, about every battle she had lost. This deal could be the only key to breaking free from this endless cycle. She lowered her head, closing her eyes briefly, and after a soft sigh, she answered, "Do I even have another choice?" Her tone was gentle but resolute. "I accept." Charles nodded with the same efficiency he brought to closing a stock market transaction. "We'll sign a contract. Since we'll have a few shared terms, I'd like to know your name. And I have one more question for you." "Why would you need a loveless womb?" Antoinette asked. "You have everything it takes to make someone of your status fall for you." Charles Woodward, still calculating and with a steel-like expression, couldn't ignore the impact of her question. He wasn't used to anyone confronting him so directly, especially when he believed he was in complete control. The engine of his Lamborghini hummed beneath his hands, and the noise of the city seemed to fade into the background. His grey eyes locked with Antoinette's, and for a brief moment, a whirlwind of emotions passed through him. Nostalgia, frustration, perhaps even a flicker of vulnerability. But he wouldn't let it show. Taking a deliberate pause, Charles inhaled deeply, the same way he might before throwing out a monumental figure in a high-stakes negotiation. His response was just another verbal transaction, a contract wrapped in words. "My name is Charles Woodward, and you're right about one thing," he said, his tone cool and calculated as usual. "I have it all. Power, wealth, influence. People respect me or fear me. But love?" He stopped, letting the word hang in the air for a second, before continuing. "Love is nothing more than a failed social contract, full of promises no one keeps. I've been there. I've had 2 marriages, both of which crumbled into ashes. They never loved me. Only what I stood for. The shine of fortune, the facade of status." Charles tilted his head slightly, as though tasting the bitterness of old memories. "Fall in love with someone of my status?" he repeated with a sharp, almost mocking tone. "I've done it twice. Both times, I learned that love is just a transaction disguised as emotion. I'm not interested in doing it again. I don't need a wife who stays for what I can offer her. I won't carry the weight of empty promises or endure another failed relationship. My only focus is my successor." His gaze hardened, the control returning, restoring him to the man who commanded markets, mastered transactions, and now held dominion over this moment. He leaned forward slightly, his tone still cold but direct. "Your words are as calculating as you," the young woman said with a sincerity that caught him off guard. "But I see something beneath all of that, Charles. I see someone who isn't just afraid of love, but craves it more than he's willing to admit. Loneliness can disguise itself as strength, but eventually, it always shows its true face." Charles didn't react. He simply looked ahead and started the car, letting the roar of the engine fill the silence between them. He drove without a word, taking her to his mansion in the Upper East Side, a marble and steel fortress, grand but lifeless, much like the man who built it. When they arrived, Charles parked the car in the underground garage and said nothing. Antoinette stared at the massive building, a mix of awe and unease washing over her. She hadn't seen this level of luxury in years. It felt like crossing an invisible threshold, stepping into a world completely foreign to her. Charles stepped out, and as Antoinette followed, he paused and glanced at her for a moment. His eyes swept over her worn clothes and fragile demeanor, the stark contrast between his spotless Lamborghini and the weathered woman he had unexpectedly brought into his life. With a small gesture, as if solving a logistical issue, he said, "Come inside with me." Finally breaking the silence, he led her up to the mansion's interior. The gleaming white marble walls, the sweeping staircase, and paintings by artists she'd only seen in books made it clear. This wasn't a home, it was a museum. The coldness of the place only emphasized its detachment, making it feel unreal. Charles guided her into a spacious living area, decorated with minimalist elegance that exuded wealth. He gave a short command to a middle-aged woman who appeared the moment they entered. "Stephanie, make her presentable, clothing, a bath, food, whatever she needs, and keep this between us. The rest of the staff doesn't need to know." His words were clinical, his tone indifferent, as though he were closing another deal. The assistant nodded, and with a warm smile that stood in stark contrast to Charles's demeanor, gestured for Antoinette to follow her down a hallway toward one of the guest rooms. "Come on, let's get you settled," Stephanie said kindly. Antoinette followed silently, still taking in her surroundings. She knew this was only the beginning of an arrangement that would forever alter her life. A couple of hours later, Charles sat in his office, a grand room lined with shelves of leather-bound books and large windows offering a sweeping view of Manhattan's skyline. Seated behind a dark wooden desk, he focused on the documents in front of him while his trusted lawyer, Tom Francis, meticulously reviewed the details of the contract. A knock interrupted the quiet. "Come in," Charles said, without lifting his eyes from the papers. His housekeeper, Elizabeth, entered with her usual composed demeanor, hands neatly clasped in front of her. "Mr. Woodward, you called for me?" she asked. Charles glanced up briefly. "Yes, Elizabeth. Bring the young lady down immediately." "Of course, sir," Elizabeth replied, and exited the room with the same calm efficiency she had entered. Minutes passed, and the room grew thick with an almost tangible tension, like the calm before a storm. Both men, absorbed in their respective tasks, waited in silence until another soft knock broke the stillness. "Come in," Charles repeated, his tone flat. The door creaked open, and what happened next left both men speechless. Standing in the doorway was Antoinette, completely transformed. Gone was the disheveled and broken figure they had seen before. Now she was radiant, exuding an almost otherworldly beauty. Her hair, now clean and shining, cascaded in soft waves, catching the light like strands of gold. Her once dull blue eyes sparkled with the clarity of a sky after a storm. She seemed taller and more assured, her posture elegant, yet understated. She wore a simple but sophisticated outfit that accentuated her slender frame, and her movements carried a quiet grace that suggested an inner blossoming. Tom Francis froze momentarily, his gaze fixed on her, as if spellbound. Finally, he managed to speak. "Miss," he murmured, breaking the silence with an unplanned compliment, "you are absolutely stunning." Antoinette, who had been looking down, lifted her eyes at his words. A soft blush colored her cheeks as she absorbed the unexpected praise. Though caught off guard, she quickly regained her composure, her expression steady once more. Charles, however, felt an unfamiliar chill run down his spine, a strange, unwelcome pang in his stomach. It was an emotion he didn't fully understand, or perhaps didn't want to acknowledge. Jealousy, dark and insistent, crept into his chest. He turned his attention to Tom, masking his discomfort. "All right," he said, his voice sharper than necessary, cutting through the moment. "Let's proceed with reviewing the contract terms." His words carried a chill as he spread the document across the desk. Antoinette stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The tension in the room was almost palpable as the three of them moved forward with a formality that hinted at unspoken feelings. In the end, the contract was signed, binding them to terms that would inevitably alter the course of their lives. That morning, Charles woke early as usual, but with an unusual weight on his mind. Manhattan's dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, the sunlight spilling through the towering windows of his mansion. The city stirred below, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The contract lingered in his mind as he walked to the wing where Antoinette slept, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. But what Charles didn't realize was that no matter how much we try to define our desires on paper, the heart remains a mystery no document can contain. He knocked softly on her door before opening it decisively. His expression, as always, was cold and unwavering. "We're leaving immediately," he announced, his tone leaving no room for debate. Antoinette, still groggy, looked at him with a mix of confusion and fatigue, her mind struggling to grasp what was happening. "Where are we going?" she asked, as she slowly got out of bed, sunlight flooding the room and softening the sharpness of Charles's words. "To fulfill the first clause of the contract," he replied curtly. Minutes later, they were in Charles's Lamborghini Diablo, the engine roaring as fiercely as the city coming to life around them. Charles drove in silence, his face as unreadable as ever. Inside the car, though, the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Antoinette stared out the window, watching the buildings blur by like fleeting shadows of her fractured life. Words lingered in her mind, deep thoughts she hadn't yet given voice to. Sometimes the quiet between two people can be louder than anything spoken. The car eventually pulled up in front of the city's most prestigious fertility clinic, a place that, like everything in Charles's world, exuded wealth and perfection. The sleek silver sign outside was a subtle marker of exclusivity, instantly recognizable to New York's upper class. Antoinette stepped out of the car, her gaze lifting toward the imposing building. In that moment, a thought crossed her mind, one that reached beyond the terms of the contract they were bound to. Bringing a life into the world is never a hollow act, no matter how it begins. While this life grows within me, it will be loved. This isn't just a deal. It's the beginning of something deeper, something no contract or fate can take away. Charles, ever silent, walked beside her, seemingly indifferent to the emotions beginning to swirl within Antoinette. Together, they passed through the automatic doors of the clinic, a place where pristine white walls seemed designed to erase doubt or hesitation. It was as if the luxury and sterility of the space could simplify the complexity of what they were about to do. Yet, inside Antoinette's heart, questions and emotions lingered unanswered. The heaviest steps are always the ones taken in resignation, for the soul never stops seeking its voice, even when silence feels like the only option. They were promptly greeted by a medical team, their professionalism polished to perfection. Every explanation of the process was delivered with measured precision, devoid of emotion, as though they too were part of a contract bound only by science. Antoinette nodded along, offering no response. Acceptance can often feel like surrender, but sometimes it's the only path forward. The process was set to be swift, but not instantaneous. Consultations, tests, and medical reviews were carefully planned to ensure everything proceeded flawlessly. In the days that followed, their visits to the clinic became routine, each one making the weight of the agreement more palpable. It hung between them, unseen but unavoidable, like a shadow. Some agreements extend far beyond paperwork. It's the promises we make to ourselves that truly shape our destinies. Antoinette, though she kept her thoughts to herself, understood that the agreement with Charles wasn't just a legal contract, but a deeper emotional responsibility that no clause could ever fully capture. Life often demands things from us that can't be written down. Sometimes, the most profound obligations are those we choose to bear without being asked. Finally, the day of the insemination arrived. As expected, the process was as clinical and detached as everything Charles had orchestrated. The sterile, controlled environment only emphasized the calculated nature of their arrangement. But for Antoinette, the coldness of the room couldn't extinguish the warmth growing inside her heart. While the medical team worked with precision, her thoughts and emotions were elsewhere, tethered to the life she was about to carry. To her, what was happening inside her body wasn't just a procedure, it was sacred. Staring at the plain white ceiling of the clinic, her mind wandered to the future. A lump formed in her throat as she closed her eyes. Something deep within her stirred, whispering truths she couldn't ignore. This isn't just a contract. This is a life. A life I will love with all my heart, even if it was born from this agreement. She rested a hand on her abdomen, sensing that her world was about to change. The love she began to feel wasn't born of a contract, but of the bond already forming between her and the life growing inside her. On the drive home, the silence in the car was thick and oppressive. Antoinette stared out the window as the city blurred by in streaks of light and shadow. Finally, Charles broke the silence, his tone as detached as ever. "This was just the first step. Now, we wait," he said, his words sounding more like the conclusion of a business deal than the beginning of a new life. She glanced at him, uneasy. His cold, pragmatic tone left her unsettled. To Charles, it seemed as though what had just happened was nothing more than another item crossed off his meticulously organized to-do list. Antoinette took a deep breath, knowing she had something to say, something she doubted Charles, with all his emotional detachment, was ready to hear. Her voice, steady but laced with emotion, broke the tension. "Children aren't just the product of desire or rational planning," she said. "They're reflections of our souls, the legacy we leave behind when we're no longer here to tell our story. Today, we've done more than fulfill a clause. We've lit a flame, one no contract could ever extinguish, a flame born of life, not wealth or agreements." Charles, who had maintained his impenetrable demeanor throughout, found himself shaken by her words. They cut through him, leaving a mark he couldn't ignore. A chill ran down his spine, an unfamiliar sensation for someone who had long buried his emotions. For the first time, he truly saw Antoinette, a woman capable of stirring something deep within his carefully guarded heart. He pulled the car to a stop on a deserted street and turned toward her, his expression unreadable, but his gaze lingering as though he were seeing her for the first time. Charles's eyes, usually cold and distant, now held an emotion he couldn't name. "What? What do you know about the soul?" he asked in a whisper that betrayed a vulnerability he had never shown before. Antoinette held his gaze, steady and unwavering, her voice calm with the wisdom of someone who had lived on the edge of life itself. "The soul isn't for sale, Charles. No contract or wealth can own it. Love, whether you accept it or not, will always find its way into what you create." Her words struck a deep chord within him, echoing in a way he couldn't ignore. A forgotten feeling crept over him, sending chills up his spine. For the first time in years, Charles Woodward had no comeback. The man who always controlled every detail of his life, who navigated existence as if it were a perfect business deal, now found himself in silence, face to face with a truth he couldn't bargain away. Since the procedure, their interactions had been minimal, limited to the essentials. Each kept their distance, yet both were keenly aware that something bigger was unfolding between them. Like a river flowing toward an unseen destination, life had begun to take shape, though neither of them could predict where it would lead. Destiny, after all, is a current that moves through us, its direction forever a mystery. Now, the fertility clinic in Manhattan awaited them. This time, the air in the car felt heavier, as if they both sensed that the words they were about to hear would alter the course of their lives. Charles drove in his usual silence, his face unreadable, but inside a mix of anticipation and something unnameable swirled. Antoinette stared out the window, outwardly calm, but inwardly consumed by a storm of emotions. The answers of the soul are rarely spoken. They dwell in the silences surrounding them. The medical team greeted them with quiet professionalism. A sign on the clinic wall read, "Creation is always a divine act, a whispered breath of the universe." The gynecologist, a composed middle-aged man, greeted them with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Woodward," he said, leading them to a private room. "Today we'll find out if the procedure was successful." As they walked to the examination room, Antoinette's heart raced. She knew this moment would change her life forever. It wasn't just a medical appointment, it was a bridge between the mundane and the profound. Without understanding why, Charles took her hand and squeezed it gently, an uncharacteristic softness in his touch. The heart, when it hears the existence of new life, can't help but beat faster. It recognizes its own echo in every beginning, Antoinette said, her words full of the wisdom that so often left Charles speechless. "Please, have a seat here, Mrs. Vaughan," the doctor said, motioning toward the examination table. Charles stood by the door, his usual detached expression in place, yet his eyes that had only ever seen numbers, now looked upon the essence of life itself. Antoinette lay back on the table, her body tense with anticipation. The gynecologist prepared the ultrasound, and the room was filled with a silence that seemed to hold the weight of the moment. Charles's eyes remained fixed on the screen, where the result of what had once been a mere written agreement was about to appear. But this was no longer just a contract, it had become something far greater. Paper may seal deals, but it is the heart that makes them real, he thought, feeling more human than he had in years. The cold gel touched Antoinette's stomach, and the room fell even quieter. The sound of a heartbeat filled the air, and everyone froze. The gynecologist studied the monitor carefully, a soft smile breaking across his face before he turned to them. "Life doesn't announce itself with fanfare," he said, "but with the simple, eternal rhythm of a beating heart." Then, with a pause that felt like eternity, he continued, "Here it is," pointing at the image on the screen. Everything seemed to be progressing as expected, but there was something else they needed to know. The specialist added this with a serious tone. Charles, whose expression had remained unreadable until then, leaned forward, curiosity written all over his face. Antoinette glanced at him sideways, sensing the tension in his posture. "What is it, doctor?" Charles asked, his voice steady but noticeably less cold than usual. The gynecologist gave a small, kind smile, pointing to several tiny shapes on the screen. "There's not just one heartbeat, there are 3, the doctor said. "Congratulations, you're expecting triplets." Time seemed to freeze. 3 heartbeats, 3 lives. Antoinette felt a chill run down her spine as tears of joy welled up in her eyes, a happiness she couldn't fully comprehend. 3 tiny hearts were beating in perfect harmony inside her. Charles felt an overwhelming wave of joy and, in an uncharacteristic gesture, leaned over to place a soft kiss on Antoinette's forehead. She, in turn, instinctively rested her hands on her belly, her thoughts filled with the new lives growing within her. Love isn't measured by contracts or agreements. It multiplies, overflows, and takes shapes even destiny cannot predict. Charles, now standing by the door again, looked at her differently this time, with an openness that suggested something inside him was beginning to thaw. He realized the woman before him wasn't just the person carrying his heir. She was someone who, in some inexplicable way, was sharing the greatest miracle of existence with him. Charles, a man unaccustomed to caring for others, felt something shift within him that afternoon, 3 months after the insemination. Later he found himself standing in the doorway of the living room, watching Antoinette as she sat on the terrace. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed her in a golden light. She gazed out at the horizon, her expression peaceful, as though her heart had found a rare moment of calm in a noisy world. Antoinette, now showing early signs of her pregnancy, brought a hand to her temple and closed her eyes briefly. Charles frowned, concern flickering across his face. He wasn't used to seeing her like this, vulnerable. She had always appeared strong, almost unshakable, even amidst the cold, calculated arrangement they'd made. Something instinctive stirred in him, compelling him to act. He walked toward the terrace with purposeful steps. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, but still carrying his characteristic reserve. Antoinette slowly opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a mix of surprise and calm. "Just a little dizzy." "I suppose it's normal," she replied, offering a faint smile, as if to downplay her discomfort. Charles hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Normally, he would have called Stephanie or someone else from the staff, but this time, something made him respond differently. Without overthinking it, he leaned down and, with a surprising gentleness at odds with his usual demeanor, lifted her into his arms. As he carried her, Charles became acutely aware of not only the lightness of her frame, but also the invisible weight of his own transformation. Antoinette, startled, looked up at him with wide eyes. "You don't have to, Charles. I can walk," she said, her tone a mix of humility and bewilderment, though there was no trace of protest in her words. "No," he replied firmly, but with an unfamiliar softness in his voice. "Let me." If you're with us this far in the story, leave a comment saying cappuccino as a token of love for us. The walk from the terrace to her room was quiet, but the silence wasn't awkward. Charles felt the rhythm of life with every step he took, her presence in his arms a poignant reminder of everything that was changing. Sometimes, the most profound emotions are expressed in moments of stillness. When they reached her bedroom door, something shifted. Using his foot to nudge it open, he crossed the threshold, noticing how Antoinette's body tensed slightly in his arms. She looked around, her previously serene eyes widening in a mix of shock and amazement. The room had been completely transformed. Every corner now spoke of the new lives they were about to welcome. Every detail in the room spoke of motherhood. The fresh scent of flowers lingered in the air, while a giant stuffed animal perched on the dresser turned the space into a sanctuary for the 3 little lives growing within her. "What is this?" Antoinette's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the stillness as her eyes scanned every corner of the room. Her gaze was filled with a mix of disbelief and wonder. Charles, who had been maintaining his usual calm demeanor, allowed a flicker of vulnerability to cross his face. "I wanted you to feel more comfortable," he said gently. "I thought you might like it." His tone was slow, almost hesitant, as if second-guessing his own decision. "I wasn't expecting this," she murmured, overwhelmed by the thoughtful details, as he carefully helped her recline onto the bed. Charles sat on the edge, quietly observing her as she took in the room's transformation. The silence between them was profound, yet it carried an unspoken depth. "I thought that every new life deserves a space filled with light," Charles finally said, his voice surprising even himself. "A place where love can find its home." Antoinette looked at him, her gaze so intense it sent a shiver down his spine. She then spoke softly, her words carrying weight. "Love asks for nothing in return, but it changes everything." Her voice was tender, deliberate, and full of emotion. Even the hardest soul eventually lets itself be reshaped by it. Charles broke eye contact for a moment, unable to bear the weight of her expression. Something within him, long sealed away, began to crack. The quiet between them grew deeper, but this time it was a shared silence, one that pulled them closer than either had anticipated. For the first time, Charles allowed himself to feel something, just a sliver of warmth. The love he had kept at bay was beginning to seep through the cracks in his armor. His hand remained intertwined with Antoinette's, and as the soft afternoon breeze drifted through the open windows, they both realized they were embarking on a journey far deeper than they had ever imagined. Charles awoke early that morning, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. Over the past few weeks, his connection with Antoinette had grown into something more profound than the mere agreement that had brought them together. Without realizing it, he had begun to care for her deeply. But today was different. Today would change everything. The mansion, despite its grandeur, was cloaked in an eerie stillness. It was as if time had paused while the three lives inside Antoinette neared their grand arrival. Charles paced down the long hallway, his thoughts consumed by the momentous event ahead. He paused outside her door, and just as he reached for the doorknob, her faint voice called out to him. "Charles, I think it's time," she whispered, her tone trembling with excitement and nerves. Standing in the doorway, her face was radiant despite her exhaustion, illuminated by an inner glow. Charles's heart skipped a beat. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side, silently helping her to her feet and preparing to whisk her off to the hospital for the moment that would forever change their lives. The Lamborghini Diablo's engine roared, but it was nothing compared to the frantic pounding of their hearts. Antoinette, one hand resting on her rounded belly, glanced sideways at Charles. She had watched him change. What had started as a purely transactional relationship now felt like something far deeper. "I'll be right here with you," Charles said softly, his voice calm but full of resolve, as if nothing in the world could pull him away from her in that moment. "Thank you, Charles," Antoinette murmured, her tone a mix of gratitude and emotion. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur. When they arrived, the medical team was already prepared and waiting. Antoinette was immediately taken to the delivery room, and Charles stayed by her side, holding her hand tightly. Time seemed to stretch as the contractions grew stronger. Each of Antoinette's breaths, each squeeze of her hand, reverberated through Charles's very core. "Breathe, Antoinette. You're doing amazing," he encouraged, watching her endure the pain and the effort of bringing not one, but 3 lives into the world. Minutes turned into hours. Finally, the first cry echoed through the room. A boy, their son. Charles felt his throat tighten, something inside him breaking and rebuilding all at once. The second cry followed shortly after. Another boy, then the third. A girl. 3 tiny hearts, 3 new lives, and every plan Charles had made before that moment seemed insignificant now. "They're perfect," Antoinette whispered, exhausted but glowing as she gazed at her newborns. Tears streamed down her face as her trembling hands caressed their tiny faces. It was a love she hadn't anticipated, a feeling that overwhelmed her completely. Charles, equally moved, held onto her hand, unable to take his eyes off the little bodies now being cradled by the nurses. For the first time in his life, he felt a connection to something he couldn't buy, control, or predict. It was life in its purest form. But amid the overwhelming joy, he noticed Antoinette's tears weren't only for happiness, There was sorrow in them too, a pain he was just beginning to understand. She cried, for the future she feared, for the unyielding clause in their agreement. Soon, she would have to leave these tiny beings she already loved with all her heart. She would have to let them go, handing them over to a life she couldn't be part of. "Charles," Antoinette sobbed, "I don't want to leave them. But this was our deal, and I'll honor it, even if it tears me apart." Charles felt his heart break a little more with every word she spoke. The joy he'd felt moments earlier was now tinged with the cold reality of their arrangement. The stark terms of their agreement, the rigid clauses and legalities, felt meaningless in the face of Antoinette's tears. Without speaking, Charles leaned down and kissed her forehead as she continued to cry. A lump rose in his throat, a pressure in his chest he'd never experienced before. He knew something inside him had shifted forever. Just like Antoinette, he couldn't ignore what truly mattered anymore. Antoinette gently touched her daughter's face again, tears still falling unchecked. She couldn't stop them. Neither could Charles. For both, everything had changed in a way they hadn't seen coming. At that moment, she realized that love, even when born from a contract, could surpass any deal written on paper. She didn't know how she would face what was coming, but for now, all she could do was cry, holding tightly to that fleeting moment with the children she had brought into the world, who soon wouldn't be hers anymore. Charles stood frozen, silently observing her pain, unable to speak. He knew this couldn't end like this. Something had to change, but he didn't yet know how. The morning after the delivery, the soft light of dawn filtered through the hospital room's windows, casting a gentle glow across the space. Antoinette rested after a grueling night. Her peaceful expression revealed the quiet satisfaction of having given life to 3 children. Charles, typically distant, had spent the night in a chair beside her bed, watching her as she slept. Though he tried to mask it, the vulnerability and exhaustion on Antoinette's face deeply moved him. As the sun rose, Charles decided to let her rest a little longer. He quietly left the room, careful not to wake her. He needed breakfast and planned to pick up a few things to make her more comfortable. When he returned to the hospital, his steps echoed purposefully down the hall. Reaching Antoinette's room, he paused, startled by what he saw. The door was slightly ajar, and from the hallway, he noticed how much the room had changed. Flowers were everywhere. Dozens of bouquets in vibrant colors filled the space. But what stopped him cold was the sight of Tom Francis, his trusted lawyer, sitting in the chair where Charles had spent the night. A strange feeling churned inside Charles as he froze in the doorway, observing the scene. Tom leaned toward Antoinette, speaking in a low voice. The words Charles overheard hit him like a blow. "Antoinette, I know everything has happened so fast, and what I'm about to say might surprise you," Tom said gently, a softness Charles had never heard from him before. "But I can't let this moment slip away." Tom paused, taking her hand delicately. "Since I met you, something changed in me. You're an extraordinary woman." He hesitated before continuing, his sincerity unmistakable. "What I feel is real. I want to be by your side, and if you'll let me, I'd like to ask you something more." Antoinette, weakened from childbirth, looked at him with a mix of astonishment and confusion, clearly unprepared for such a confession. "Tom," she whispered, unable to find the right words. Charles felt a sharp pang in his chest. The flowers, Tom's tone, the way he held Antoinette's hand. It all became painfully clear. His lawyer and friend weren't there just for legal matters or out of courtesy. Tom was deeply in love with her. Still holding her hand, Tom continued, "Antoinette, I don't want this to be just a passing moment in your life. I want to give you more. I want you to have the chance to be with someone who will take care of you, who will offer you a home, without pressure, without clauses, without contracts. Just us." He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "Antoinette, will you marry me?" he asked, revealing a stunning ring. At that precise moment, Charles could no longer hold himself back. He pushed the door open, stepping into the room. The sound of the door startled them, making Tom release Antoinette's hand and turn to face him, composed as ever. "Charles?" Tom greeted him with a calm smile, as though nothing unusual was happening. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Charles walked slowly toward the bed, his face calm, but his eyes betraying an internal storm. He glanced at Antoinette, who looked as shocked as he was by what had just unfolded. Then her gaze shifted to the flowers. Those vibrant bouquets filled the room with a sweetness reminiscent of Rome. Flowers that weren't there when she left. "Tom," Charles said coldly. "The flowers are yours, aren't they?" Tom nodded, standing calmly in the room. "After all, she deserves to be surrounded by beauty. Don't you agree, Charles?" His comment, though mild in tone, hung in the air like a challenge. Charles didn't respond right away. The tension in the room was palpable, and inside, he wrestled with a storm of emotions. Jealousy and confusion, feelings he wasn't accustomed to handling. "I see you've offered her something else as well," Charles said, his voice tinged with icy sarcasm. "Marriage, Tom? Here in the hospital just after she's given birth?" Tom rose from his chair with a deliberate calm. "Yes, Charles. I've offered her something real, something that isn't bound by contracts and agreements. I believe that's what she needs. Someone who cares about her for who she is, not because of some arrangement." Charles's fists clenched as he fought to maintain his composure. He had never felt so out of control, so exposed. All this time, he thought everything had been perfectly calculated. He had convinced himself he was the sole architect of Antoinette's and their children's futures. Now, he realized that wasn't true. Tom's presence was undeniable, and his intentions extended beyond mere legality. "I don't think this is the right time to push emotional decisions on someone who has just gone through what Antoinette has endured," Charles said firmly. "She needs rest, not more pressure." Tom met Charles's gaze, a mix of defiance and calm in his expression. "You're right, Charles. This isn't the time for pressure, but it's also not the time to pretend feelings don't exist. What I feel for her won't just disappear because you want everything to stay a business arrangement." Antoinette, who had remained silent, looked at them both in disbelief. She was exhausted and confused, and the last thing she needed was for two men to start a power struggle in her hospital room. "Tom, Charles," she whispered, raising a hand to her forehead. "Please, not now. I just want to rest." Both men stepped back, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control. Tom cast one last glance at Antoinette before heading to the door. "Rest, Antoinette. I'll be here if you need me," he said softly before leaving. When the door closed, Charles stood silently by the bed, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was heavy, but it carried an unspoken truth neither of them was ready to face. Charles slowly sat in the empty chair beside the bed, watching as Antoinette closed her eyes, overwhelmed by everything that had unfolded. But as he watched her sleep, one thought became increasingly clear in his mind. This wasn't just a contract anymore, and that terrified him. 3 months had passed since Antoinette had given birth to the triplets. 3 months filled with overwhelming love for her children, but also a deep, aching sadness over the impending separation outlined in the contract. According to its terms, the day had arrived. The day she was to leave the mansion, leave her children, and walk away from everything she had come to know since signing the agreement. In her room, surrounded by the few belongings that reminded her of her children, Antoinette packed what little she could take with her. A small suitcase, nearly empty, held only the bare essentials. The wealth Charles had promised her meant nothing now. She didn't want the money. As she closed the suitcase, the pain in her chest felt unbearable. Tears streamed down her face as she held each of her 3 babies in her arms, one by one, kissing their tiny faces, knowing this would be the last time she'd see them. The triplets, unaware of their mother's anguish, slept peacefully in their cribs. Antoinette stood watching them, etching every little detail into her memory. Their angelic faces, tiny fingers, and soft breaths. She had signed the contract, hoping it would secure a future, but never imagined it would cost her soul. I should have stayed a wanderer, she thought through her sobs, rather than endure this agony tearing my heart apart. She loved those children with all her being. And though she hated to admit it, she loved him too. Antoinette descended the mansion's grand staircase with heavy, deliberate steps, dragging her small suitcase behind her. Each step felt like a dagger to her heart. The sound of her shoes echoed in the vast, empty hall, making the mansion's grandeur feel cold and distant. What had once been a sanctuary now felt like nothing more than a reminder of the pain awaiting her. Reaching the massive front door, her trembling hand rested on the doorknob. She couldn't believe this was really the end. Drawing a deep breath to steel herself, she prepared to leave for the airport and head to a country that no longer felt like home. She was determined to honor the contract she had signed. But as her hand began to turn the knob, a deep voice cut through the silence like a thunderclap. "Antoinette, where are you going?" Charles's voice boomed from somewhere deep within the mansion. She froze but didn't turn around. "It's Tom Francis, isn't it?" he pressed, stepping closer. "It's because you've fallen for him, isn't it?" Antoinette shut her eyes tightly, her emotions swirling in a storm of pain and anger. She took a moment to steady herself before slowly turning to face him. Her tear-streaked face met his. "You don't understand anything," she said, her voice filled with a mix of frustration and despair. "This isn't about Tom Francis. Remember the last clause of the contract? I have to leave this mansion and leave the country 90 days after giving birth. That's what we agreed on, Charles." He stopped just feet away, breathing heavily. But his eyes betrayed more than concern. They revealed fear of losing her. Without a word, Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out the contract. The document that had defined their strange relationship from the beginning. Holding it firmly in front of her, he didn't read or argue over it. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. With a sudden surge of emotion, Charles began tearing the contract to shreds, piece by piece, letting the fragments fall to the floor. Antoinette stared at him, stunned. "I'm sorry, Antoinette," Charles said, his voice breaking as he dropped to his knees before her. "Do you know what you've taught me? Remember when I told you I couldn't love any woman again because I'd been hurt by 2 wives who only cared about money? You showed me something different without even trying. It's madness to hate all roses because one thorn pricked you." His voice cracked as he repeated the line. "I don't want you to go. I don't care about the contract or the deal we made. The only thing I care about is you staying here, with our children, with me. I'm not asking you to love me or to change how you feel. Even if you love Tom or someone else, just stay. Stay for them. Stay for the triplets." The anguish etched on Antoinette's face began to ease as she took in Charles' raw vulnerability. Charles had always been a man of unwavering strength and control, someone who never bowed to anyone, not out of pride, but because he had built a life where everything was neatly in order. Yet here he was, on his knees, pleading. Antoinette watched him for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, with a mix of tenderness and resolve, she raised her hand and gently placed it on his head. "Amara Tom Sawyer," she said with a faint, bittersweet laugh, her tears now mingling with a different emotion. "Charles, how can you be so foolish?" Her voice broke slightly as her fingers brushed through his hair. "It's you I've loved since the very first day I saw you." Charles looked up, disbelief flashing in his eyes at her words. Antoinette smiled through her tears and continued. "It was always you. From the moment you saved me on that street, from the instant our paths crossed in such a strange way, even though I never wanted to admit it, even when you hid me behind the terms of a contract, my heart was always yours." Still kneeling, Charles felt his entire world shift around those words. What had started as a cold, calculated agreement had grown into something far deeper than he could have imagined. "Antoinette," he whispered, taking her hand in his, "I love you too. I've loved you all this time, even when I tried to deny it. Please stay. Not for the children, not because of the contract, but for us. I want us to be a family, to share our lives together." He paused, his voice filled with emotion. "It would be the greatest honor of my life if you'd be my wife and my one true love." Antoinette looked at him, her tear-filled eyes shining, and without another moment's hesitation, she dropped the suitcase in her hand and wrapped her arms tightly around him. Charles held her close, their embrace filled with the longing and warmth they had both yearned for. "I love you, Charles," she whispered through her sobs. Charles pulled her closer, and as he held her in his arms, he leaned in and sealed their unspoken words with a kiss, deep and passionate, carrying the weight of everything left unsaid for months. Months later, the once cold mansion was alive with joy and laughter. Charles and Antoinette's wedding was an intimate celebration filled with love and happiness. In their arms were their triplets, each a living testament to the fact that what began as an impersonal contract had blossomed into something extraordinary, a family. Charles had finally found what he had unknowingly been searching for, something greater than himself. As he gazed at his wife and children, he realized he hadn't just signed a contract, he'd made a lifelong pact with love. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.